Hello! Today I'm going to be reading an excellent book about conquering your fear or your anxieties. This is called Mikey and the Dragons. And this is about a little boy who starts off being afraid of everything, but he learns sometimes what you're afraid of is just something you don't understand yet. And if you face it and ask questions and give it a try, you might learn it's not so bad after all. There once was a little boy named Mike, and there were many things he didn't like. He was scared of spiders and beetles and bugs, and always thought they hid under the rugs. They were creepy and crawly and nasty and mean, and he ran from every bug he had ever seen. But it wasn't only insects that gave Mikey a scare. There were many other things which Mike did not care. He left the light on when he went to sleep at night, because he was scared there were monsters that were ready to bite. Hidden in his closet or under his bed, he thought they might get him when he lay down his head. He imagined monsters with giant teeth and claws, grabbing his neck with its giant paws. And if it wasn't monsters coming to take him away, it would be slimy snakes slithering his way. Yes, Mikey was scared of evil snakes too, and horrified of what they could do. They could sneak into the house and hide in his drawer, and then bite him to bits. Of that he was sure. There were many other things that gave Mikey a scare, which meant there were many things that he wouldn't try to dare. He didn't like water or to go for a swim because he was afraid giant sharks might come and get him. And he didn't like playgrounds with ladders or slides. He thought if he fell off, he would certainly die. Yes, as you can see, things for Mikey were bad because being afraid made Mikey feel sad. And because so many things scared Mikey to the bone, it turns out that Mikey was often left alone. He would sit by himself and look at the sky, and then he would quietly ask himself, why? Why did so many things give him a scare? And how could he ever overcome all that fear? How could he ever stand up and be brave? Or would being afraid always make him a slave? And then one day, Mikey noticed a book. And he opened it up and took a quick look. It had pictures of dragons with fangs like a snake and all kinds of scary things that made Mikey shake. But in the pictures, there was a little boy too. And that little boy didn't look scared. It looked like he knew what to do. So even though Mikey was scared indeed, he decided he would give that book a read. And he opened the first page, which he eagerly read, and this is what the dragon book said. The Dragon Prince, as told by Sir Jake, Knight of the Sea, Air, and Land. There was once a kingdom long ago and far away, and the kingdom had suffered a horrible day. Their protector and leader, their king, he had died, and when they found out, the whole village cried. When the king was alive, he was a powerful force, but now they took him away by carriage and horse. They knew they would miss him, and that made them sad. But there was also something else that made the villagers feel bad. The king had always been so strong and brave, he had protected the kingdom from the dragon cave. The dragon cave was just over the hill and filled with scary creatures that were ready to kill. The villagers imagined horrible dragons of every single type, who thought people in the kingdom were especially ripe. The people thought dragons had breath of fire, and that dragons must stand 20 feet tall or even higher. They thought the dragons had sword-stopping scales and powerful, long, razor-sharp tails. But the brave king never let the beasts around. He stood up and held his ground. And as long as the king had been king, none of the dragons had ever done a thing. Yes, the king had always kept the dragons at bay by going out bravely into the fray. But the villagers thought with fear, without the king, who would beat the dragons and keep them safe every night? Now that the king was gone, there was only one person to carry on. But that person was not big or mighty or strong. In fact, he hadn't been alive all that long. Now the person who had dragons to chase was just a little boy with a smiling face. Yes, the person that must now stand up and be bold, was just a little prince, only 7 years old. and the people in the village just couldn't be sure. Can this young boy, little prince, can he endure? How can someone so young and so small stand up to dragons so big and so tall? And the little prince himself, he also didn't know if he had the courage it would take to go. Because he was so little and small and young, he didn't know if he could get the job done. How could he make the mean dragons yield when he could barely lift up a sword or a shield? But no one else dared step up and fight, not the kingdom's guards or even the knights. So even though the prince was scared, he still knew that fighting the dragons was something he must do. So he went to the king's bedroom and opened the door, and he went inside and walked across the floor, and he opened an old chest that was tall and wide, where the king had kept all his war gear inside. The shield was so big and the sword was so long. It was no wonder the king had been so strong. But the prince was a kid, not a king like his dad, and to lift up that gear took all the strength that he had. And that made the prince get even more nervous, and he wondered if he was ready for service. Fighting dragons was such a scary task. The prince to himself had some questions to ask. How can a little boy ever be a man? How could the little prince even make a stand? But at the bottom of the chest there was a small note, and it looked like something the king had wrote. So, just when the prince thought it was over and done, he picked up the note, and it said, "To my son." And he took a deep breath and opened the note he had found, and this is what his father, the king, had written down. To my son, if you are reading this now, it means I am gone, and you are the one that must carry on. Our kingdom is now what you must save, and to do that, you have to be brave. I know that you think you don't know what to do, but remember, I was once a little boy too. I was also small and had fear in my heart, and I didn't even know where to start. I couldn't imagine going over that hill to face dragons I thought wanted to kill. But don't worry, son. You will be just fine if you can keep these things in mind. The dragons, they really aren't big at all. It's only in our minds that we make them so tall. Inside our brains, fear always gets overblown, especially with things that are completely unknown. But when fear settles in and gets a hold of you, here are some simple things you must do. Stand up straight and hold your head high, and look at your fears right in the eye. Don't look away, don't try and hide, and know that you have great strength deep inside. When you stand up and you go into the fray, you'll feel your fears start to go away, and though there will still be horror you feel, the things you are scared of are not such a big deal. This isn't to say that you won't feel a scare. Fear is a feeling that all of us share. Fear is normal for every person on earth, and this is where a hero proves his worth. To be scared, you run away when the danger is near, but a hero will face the things that they fear. So that is what you must do, my son. Face your fears and do not run. And I promise you, when you meet them, you'll see that you are just as strong as me. The dragons that you think are so mighty and mean are never really as bad as they seem. Most of the things that fill you with dread are usually just made up in your head. Your father, the king. Well, the boy was still scared, though not quite as bad, as he got done reading that note from his dad. So the next day he got up and began to get ready. He was still scared, but the note kept his mind steady. Of course, he would still feel some fear in his mind, but he knew he would have to keep it confined. And despite all the fear that he had, he knew he needed to listen to his dad. So he picked up his shield and picked up his sword, and he held up his chin and went out the door. And the people of the kingdom knew just where he was going, and the crowd in the streets just kept on growing. And they stood and they cheered and they shouted and smiled and hoped their kingdom could be saved by this child. And And the prince gave a crisp salute and marched past them down the main route. And at the end, he stood up very straight, and he simply walked right out of the gate. Once outside the kingdom, he tried to stay brave as he walked towards the dragon cave. He could smell the fire of their breath, and he wondered if he would meet his death. But he remembered what his father had said, that most of his fear was just made up in his head. When he got near the cave, he looked all around, but he saw no dragons upon the ground. So he walked closer, and he heard some noise, and though it scared him a bit, he still kept his poise. And then he got to the edge of the cave and looked in, and he saw countless numbers of dragons within. But when the dragons saw him, they scattered and hid, even though the prince was just a little kid. And the prince, he couldn't believe his eyes, because, to the prince's great surprise, the dragons, though many, were as small as can be. Most of them only came up to his knee. And when they breathed fire, it was just a tiny little flame that any matchstick or candle can put to shame. And their teeth, they were very sharp and white and shiny, but they were also very, very, very tiny. The teeth that they had were as small as a pin, and they wouldn't even bite through the prince's skin. So the prince walked right into the cave, just as a prince or a king should behave. And one small dragon came out looking sweet and sat down on the ground at the prince's feet. And the prince was convinced by this little sight that his father, the king, was absolutely right. The fear was just like the king had said. It had all been made up in the prince's head. And when the prince left the cave and headed back into town, all the people saw him come down, and they clapped their hands and shouted with joy that the kingdom had been saved by this little boy. And the prince climbed up and stood on the wall, and this is what he told them all. There really is no reason for dread. All of the fear is made up in your head. The dragons, they cannot do anything to us, and there's really no reason to fuss. So have no fear of a dragon attack. In fact, the dragons will never come back. And with that, all of the townspeople cheered because the prince had quelled the thing that they feared. And the prince tried to tell them the dragons were small, but they would not listen to him at all. So the prince carried on protecting the town, and of course he never let them down. Because the dragons were so small, they really were no danger at all. And the kingdom carried on forever, filled with laughter, and all the people lived happily ever after. And that was the end of the dragon book, and Mikey was so glad he had taken a look, because he realized something that he never knew. If you are afraid, there are things you can do. Instead of hiding and running away, stand up and try to face what makes you afraid. And from that day forth, Mikey changed his mind, and he left his fears and his worries behind. Even when he was afraid of something out there, he knew now how to control his fear. He would stand up straight and hold his head high, and like the prince, he would give his fears a try. And that is always the best thing to do. If there is something that really scares you, don't get controlled by the feelings of dread, and remember that most of the fear is in your head. This isn't to say that you won't be afraid, but you should know that fear is okay. Everyone gets nervous and has a good scare and feels like they are going into the dragon's lair. But when that happens and you don't want to go, think of the lesson that the prince got to know. That when you are feeling so scared of it all, just remember that really the dragons are small. The end. Thank you for listening, and I hope that the next time you're feeling nervous about trying something new, that you can do what Mikey and the prince can do, and give it a try. Thanks for listening.